The evolutionary competition, Darwin, Wallace, and the rivalry that shaped the origin of species. A historical dramatization. A quiet morning at Down House. Charles Darwin paced anxiously across the worn carpet of his study at Down House. It was a bright morning in June of 1858, and the sunbeams cut through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes swirling in the air. Darwin's desk was littered with unopened letters, half-finished notes on pigeon breeding, and dog-eared pages from his ongoing manuscript, a tome he had been laboring over for nearly 2 decades, but had yet to finalize for publication. He paused by the window, hands folded behind his back, looking out at his beloved garden in the distance. Outside, the hush was broken only by the distant caw of rooks. His mind, however, was far from tranquil. He had received, just the day before, a letter from the far side of the world, an essay from Alfred Russel Wallace, the young naturalist whom Darwin regarded with both admiration and a gentle sense of mentorship. Wallace's letter hailed from Ternate in the Malay Archipelago, and its contents were unsettling in their familiarity. Darwin's wife, Emma, opened the door gently. "Charles, my dear, you haven't touched your breakfast," she said softly. Startled out of his thoughts, Darwin turned around, regarding her with an apologetic smile. His eyes were weary, a subtle sign of the silent war that had been waged in his mind all night. "I am sorry, Emma. I just have so much on my mind. Perhaps I shall eat later." Emma took a step closer, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Is it another letter? Something has clearly rattled you." Darwin nodded. "Yes, a letter from Wallace. He has outlined a theory, Emma, a theory that aligns almost precisely with my own ideas on how species evolve through natural selection." Emma could see the weight on his face. "But that is good news, is it not? You have always spoken kindly of Alfred Wallace's intelligence and good sense." With a sigh, Darwin sank into the chair by his desk and stared at Wallace's essay. "Good news? In many ways, yes. It verifies that we are not alone in seeing the truth of how life changes, yet it also places me in the most difficult of dilemmas. I have delayed publishing my ideas for so long, and now someone else has come forward with nearly identical conclusions. I do not want to be seen as taking credit for his work, or to lose credit for my own." Emma squeezed his shoulder, then turned to leave him to his thoughts. Just before stepping out, she offered a final gentle remark. "Whatever you decide, Charles, I trust you will do it honorably." When the door shut, Darwin exhaled, gazing once more at Wallace's essay, as though it were some fateful harbinger of doom and triumph in equal measure, a glimpse into their lives. Before they found themselves at this juncture of overlapping discoveries, Darwin and Wallace had led distinct lives shaped by different sets of fortunes. Darwin was born into relative privilege on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury. His father was the wealthy physician Robert Darwin, and his paternal grandfather was the renowned poet-physician Erasmus Darwin, whose verses often hinted at transmutationist ideas about life. Growing up, Charles was not a model student in his early years. He frequently found himself more interested in hunting and collecting beetles than in rote learning. All that changed with his enrollment at Christ's College, Cambridge. There he met influential figures such as the botanist John Stevens Henslow, who recommended him as the companion and gentleman naturalist to Captain Robert Fitzroy of the HMS Beagle. Darwin's life would be forever altered by that fateful voyage from 1831 to 1836. Observations of finches, tortoises, and geological formations across South America and the Galapagos Islands seeded the beginnings of his radical theory of transmutation. Yet Darwin, cautious and meticulous, spent over 20 years gathering evidence before feeling ready to publish on the subject. Alfred Russel Wallace, on the other hand, was born on January 8, 1823, into a family of modest means in Usk, Monmouthshire. Where Darwin's future was paved by wealth and connections, Wallace had to fight for every penny. He worked as a surveyor for a time, fostering a keen interest in geography and the distribution of animals and plants. Fascinated by natural history, he embarked on expeditions to the Amazon and later to the Malay Archipelago, enduring hardships that included shipwreck, disease, and near starvation. During his travels, Wallace developed a fascination with how species differed from island to island, culminating in an intuition remarkably akin to Darwin's, survival of the fittest through natural selection. Yet for all their differences, Darwin and Wallace had gradually developed a respectful friendship. Darwin admired Wallace's robust fieldwork and egalitarian spirit. Wallace in turn appreciated Darwin's careful methodology and the support that he, as an established naturalist, offered in guiding Wallace's fledgling scientific career. Alfred in the Malay Archipelago. While Darwin was quietly working away at Down House, Wallace was navigating the dense jungles and island chains of the Malay Archipelago. Borneo, Singapore, the Moluccas, Wallace traversed them all, braving tropical illness and the unrelenting heat. Whenever local sailors offered cautionary tales of pirates or malaria-ridden swamps, Wallace pressed on, enticed by the richness of the biodiversity. On a stiflingly hot day in Ternate, as water dripped from the thatched roof of his humble lodging, Wallace found himself beset by a fever. With his head throbbing and soaked in sweat, he turned his mind to a puzzle that had dogged him for years. How did new species come into being? Was there a law or principle that directed which species survived and which went extinct? With feverish clarity, Wallace's thoughts congealed into an elegant concept. In nature, individuals of a species vary ever so slightly. Those variations best suited to the environment survive longer and reproduce, passing their favorable traits onward. Over time, this pressure shapes the species. By the time the fever subsided, Wallace had penned down his Ternate essay, an abstract of which he would send to Darwin, whom he regarded as an eminent authority on the subject. He had no inkling, however, of the storm that would arise once Darwin read his essay, upon receiving the Ternate essay. In his study, Darwin held Wallace's letter in trembling hands. The essay's words stared back at him, echoing the conclusions to which he himself had carefully, if quietly, arrived. Rubbing his forehead, Darwin closed his eyes to gather his thoughts. "Good God," he whispered. "He has it. He sees it just as I do." His mind flitted to the thousands of pages of notes he had accumulated since the Beagle voyage, on barnacles, pigeons, domesticated animals, embryology. All that time he had been honing and polishing his argument, hoping to publish a magnum opus that might change the course of biology. And here, in this short treatise from Ternate, was the same argument, crystallized. He felt both relief he was not alone in his convictions, and sudden panic. Was he too late? Had he allowed hesitation and personal grief, including the devastating loss of his daughter Annie 7 years earlier, to hamper a discovery that was rightfully his to announce first? He thought of the advice he had recently received from his close friends, the geologist Charles Lyell and the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker, urging him to publish soon. For a while, Darwin was silent, eyes cast downward. Then he rose from the chair, letter clutched in hand, and strode down the hallway to find Emma. He found her in the drawing room, quietly mending a child's gown. Looking up, she saw the same haunted expression as before. "Charles, do sit," she said gently. He sat but could hardly contain his agitation. "Emma," he began, his voice low, "this essay, it is identical in principle to my own work. We have arrived at the same mechanism for how species evolve. What shall I do?" Emma studied her husband carefully. She well knew how deeply he cared for the moral dimensions of such issues. "What does your heart tell you?" she asked. "It tells me to act honorably," Darwin replied. "But I also realize that if I do nothing Wallace may publish on his own, I would not blame him. Indeed, he has the right. But for me, after all these years, that would be—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the sense of lost opportunity swirling inside him. "Consult your friends," Emma said at length. "You have often said that Dr. Hooker and Mr. Lyell are men of sound judgment. Let them guide you to the proper course." Darwin nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Yes, yes, that is precisely what I shall do." A consultation with colleagues. Within days, Darwin made the journey to London. Even the rumble of carriage wheels on cobblestones seemed to thunder with his doubts. Tucked inside his pocket were Wallace's essay and Darwin's own decade's worth of notes in condensed form. He arrived first at the imposing house of Sir Charles Lyell. Lyell, then in his early 60s, was the preeminent geologist of his age, known for his principles of geology, works that had influenced Darwin's own thinking on gradual change. Over tea, Darwin explained the situation. "Lyell," he began, fiddling nervously with a teaspoon, "Wallace has come upon the principle of natural selection. It is precisely the thing I have been working on in secret for 20 years. I have only shared it with a few, including yourself." Lyell's brow furrowed. "Then the time for secrecy is over, Charles. You know that Hooker and I have urged you for years to publish a short preliminary paper. Wallace's essay is both brilliant and timely. It would be a shame for you not to receive credit for your own priority." "I don't want to overshadow Wallace," Darwin replied. "He discovered this independently, and that deserves recognition." Lyell nodded. "There is a way to be fair to both. Submit Wallace's paper alongside a summary of your own findings to the Linnean Society. It will be read jointly. Let the scientific world see that the principle of natural selection has been discovered by two minds at once." Darwin's relief was apparent, though his frown did not fully vanish. "But what if Wallace objects?" he asked. "He has entrusted this to me in good faith, without suspecting I might take up arms to rush into publication." "We must trust that Wallace, being your friend, will understand," Lyell answered gently. "If anything, it may please him to have his contribution recognized formally by the Linnean Society, rather than as an obscure manuscript from the Far East." Darwin took a moment to gather himself, feeling the first glimmer of hope. He would also speak with Joseph Hooker before finalizing any arrangements. At least now the path forward had come into view: a joint presentation, Hooker's intervention. The following day, Darwin had dinner with Dr. Joseph Dalton Hooker at Kew. Hooker, a botanist with a meticulous mind and a confident demeanor, was Darwin's intimate friend and confidant. Over fish and potatoes, the conversation turned swiftly to Wallace's essay. "Let us read it at the Linnean Society along with a short account of your own work," Hooker reiterated, echoing Lyell's sentiment. "Charles, do not fret. You have countless letters, some from as far back as 1844, that lay out your theory in detail. That is ample proof of your priority in the matter. Yet it would be churlish not to acknowledge Wallace's independent discovery." Darwin sipped his wine, stared at the flickering candlelight upon the table, and asked, "What about Wallace's feelings? He may be suspicious that I am using my connections to overshadow him. It is not in my character to claim more than I deserve." Hooker smiled kindly. "Wallace is a modest fellow from what I know of him. He wrote to you precisely because he recognized you as the leading authority on such questions. I suspect he will be grateful for the attention. Furthermore, given your many children and responsibilities, you've been delayed. This turn of events might be the very impetus you need." Darwin sat back in his chair. Indeed, he had considered publishing a brief essay in 1844, spurred on by the encouragement of friends. But personal tragedies, the death of his father, and especially his daughter Annie's passing, had paralyzed him. Now fate had delivered him a stark choice: publish or allow Wallace to publish first. Hooker's final words before they parted solidified Darwin's resolve. "Charles, you have always strived for truth in science. Let that be your guide. We shall organize a joint reading at the Linnean Society." Darwin agreed, albeit with lingering trepidation. Wallace's early explorations. While Darwin made preparations in England, one might wonder about Wallace's reaction. In truth, Wallace had no inkling of the maelstrom his essay had created. He had written Darwin more as a mentor figure, hoping for advice on publication. In return, Wallace still awaited a response, oblivious to the significance of what was transpiring across oceans. A flashback to Wallace's youth reveals a man shaped by adversity. As a child, he saw his family struggle with finances, which forced him to leave school at the age of 14. He found work as a surveyor and later taught at a mechanics institute, scraping together knowledge of biology, chemistry, and geology in the stolen hours of his free time. Eventually, Wallace saved enough to journey to Brazil with the naturalist Henry Walter Bates in 1848. For 4 years he collected specimens, only to lose much of his collection in a disastrous shipwreck on his return journey. Undeterred, he set out again, this time to the Malay Archipelago, spurred by his insatiable curiosity about the distribution of species. That same vigor and resilience had given birth to the Ternate essay. Little did he suspect that Darwin, simultaneously, was preparing to present Wallace's ideas, alongside his own, to one of the most prestigious scientific bodies in London. Organising the Linnean Society meeting. The Linnean Society of London was an august institution, deeply rooted in the study of natural history. Its members included some of Britain's most eminent scientists, botanists, zoologists and geologists, who shaped the frontiers of Victorian science. The meeting, scheduled for July 1, 1858, promised to be a fairly ordinary affair by outward appearances. Yet behind the scenes, an extraordinary arrangement was in the works. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, Darwin suffered personal tragedy once again. His youngest son, Charles Waring Darwin, fell ill and died. The heartbreak cast a pall over Darwin's life, and he withdrew from public view. This tragedy rendered him unable to attend the presentation in person, which only deepened his emotional turmoil. Nevertheless, he trusted Hooker and Lyell to handle matters. Short extracts from Darwin's extensive manuscripts, including a letter to Asa Gray, dated 1857, and an outline of his theory from 1844, were prepared by Hooker and Lyell. They would be read alongside Wallace's Ternate essay, in a joint demonstration of the new theory of natural selection. It was as fair a solution as they could manage under the circumstances. On the morning of July 1st, as Hooker and Lyell made their way to the Society, the sky was an overcast grey, threatening to rain. A modest crowd of naturalists gathered, some more curious than others about the treatises to be read. Darwin, too bereft to attend, stayed at Down House in silent grief, trusting his friends to do right by both him and Wallace. A meeting that changed science. At the appointed hour, the Linnean Society's secretary called the room to order. Joseph Hooker cleared his throat, nervous but resolute. Charles Lyell, the revered geologist, sat by his side, scanning the gathered faces, some skeptically polite, others intrigued. Hooker began by explaining the unusual circumstances. "Gentlemen, we have two naturalists to acknowledge here, Mr. Charles Darwin, known to many of us, and Mr. Alfred Russel Wallace, presently in the Malay Archipelago. Both have contributed singular insights into the origin of species. Sir Charles Lyell and I are tasked with presenting their papers." Murmurs rippled through the audience. The hush that followed was thick with anticipation. Lyell took up Wallace's essay first, reading the young naturalist's words on the struggle for existence. The crisp language conveyed Wallace's arguments with forceful clarity. Then Hooker presented Darwin's extracts, which, though more fragmented, displayed the painstaking thoroughness of 2 decades' research. To the casual listener, the arguments might have sounded nearly identical. The constant competition among members of the same species, the survival of better adapted variations, the gradual accumulation of changes over many generations. Yet those with a keen ear recognized that Darwin's approach was more extensive. He had tested variations in domestic pigeons, studied the beaks of Galapagos finches, and meticulously catalogued instances of artificial selection by breeders. Wallace's essay was more compact, but no less remarkable in its lucidity and boldness. By the time both readings concluded, the audience stirred but did not erupt. In a somewhat anticlimactic manner, the meeting moved on to other business. Victorian societies were, after all, known for their decorum. Few in that room grasped the magnitude of what had just transpired. The announcement of a theory that would revolutionize biology and the public's understanding of humanity's place in nature. Darwin and Wallace correspond. A few weeks later, as news of the joint reading began to circulate, Wallace finally received word in Ternate. He opened Darwin's letter with curiosity tinged by a hint of anxiety. The letter explained the situation. How Darwin, in receipt of Wallace's essay, had conferred with Lyell and Hooker, and how they all agreed to present Wallace's paper alongside extracts of Darwin's own unpublished work at the Linnean Society. After reading it, Wallace laid the letter aside and exhaled. "So Darwin has not only read my work, but arranged for my findings to be presented in London," he mused. Then, with a sheepish grin, he realized what an honor it was, albeit in absentia. For a moment, he could scarcely believe that his fever-induced idea had caused such a stir. Later, he confided in his assistant Ali, who helped him with collecting specimens. "I never intended to hurry Mr. Darwin. Wallace said, half laughing. I wrote because I so admired his knowledge. Had I known it would lead to a joint presentation, I might have written differently. Ali, though he did not fully grasp the scientific nuances, grinned in response. But you should be proud, Tuan, he said gently. Wallace nodded, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He resolved to write Darwin a heartfelt letter of gratitude. Despite the difference in their stations and the oceans between them, Wallace recognized that this event bound him to Darwin as never before. Darwin's gratitude. Back in Kent, Darwin read Wallace's letter of thanks and breathed a sigh of relief. He had worried that Wallace might feel overshadowed, but the younger man's words exuded genuine appreciation. In his home library, Darwin carefully filed Wallace's correspondence among the many letters from colleagues around the globe. Pausing, he thought back on his earliest fascination with the mutability of species, collecting beetles as a student, observing mockingbirds in the Galapagos, reading Malthus on population. The theory of natural selection had grown from these seeds of curiosity, shaped by countless hours of thought and experiment. Now it was out in the world, no longer his secret. He felt a strange combination of liberation and vulnerability. Over dinner that evening, Emma asked him if he was at peace now. Darwin considered her question. I am thankful that the matter is resolved, he admitted. Wallace seems not the least bit resentful. Still, I wonder if either of us truly grasps the storm that may arise once our ideas are more widely read. Emma offered a wry smile. A storm indeed, but necessary, I should think. The truth will always out, Charles, and the world deserves to know it. He reached for her hand, grateful that she, even when her own religious convictions wavered, remained his staunch ally. Seeds of friendship. Although Darwin and Wallace were separated by age, background, and location, a camaraderie blossomed from that moment onward. Their correspondence surged, each letter bridging thousands of miles yet uniting them in a shared scientific pursuit. Darwin recommended books and journals to Wallace. Wallace, in turn, sent Darwin exotic insect specimens and observations gleaned from the field. Darwin admired Wallace's grit and willingness to endure the tropics for data few other European naturalists would gather firsthand. He once wrote, I deeply envy your strength and perseverance, traversing those jungles while I must rummage in libraries. Wallace, for his part, marvelled at Darwin's thoroughness, saying in return, Your domestic experiments with pigeons and barnacles are a wonder to me, revealing patterns I should not have suspected. It was a friendship founded on mutual respect, and a shared commitment to unveiling nature's secrets. They might differ in personality, Darwin, cautious and introspective, Wallace, adventurous and free-thinking, but the core of their bond lay in their unwavering curiosity about the natural world. The publication of On the Origin of Species. After the Linnaean Society reading, Darwin pressed on with finishing what would become his magnum opus. He condensed thousands of pages of notes into a single volume, deciding on a concise abstract rather than a massive tome. In November 1859, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection was published. The entire print run of 1,250 copies sold out on the first day, signalling a public appetite for Darwin's daring ideas, or at the very least, a prurient interest in controversy. Wallace, in the Malay Archipelago, waited months for his copy, which arrived battered and water-stained by the time it reached him. Still, he was thrilled to see the thoroughness of Darwin's arguments. He composed a letter of admiration that glowed with unreserved praise. A triumph of reasoning, Wallace declared. Never have I encountered such a patient, skillful demonstration of nature's laws. Darwin responded with measured gratitude. We differ only in some finer points, dear Wallace, but on the whole, we are in remarkable agreement, he wrote. Those finer points, as Darwin put it, would soon emerge as significant differences, especially regarding humankind's place in the tree of life. The growing divide, human mind and consciousness. Initially, Wallace and Darwin saw eye to eye about natural selection's ability to explain the evolution of species. Both recognized that the principle elegantly accounted for intricate adaptations, like the long tongues of pollinating insects or the camouflage of leaf-mimicking insects. But as they expanded their theories to include the origin of humanity, a gap emerged in their interpretations. Darwin remained steadfast in his belief that humans too were products of the same natural forces that shaped all other life. Though he recognized that humans possessed profound intellectual and moral faculties, Darwin insisted these too had come about gradually. He wrote in The Descent of Man, published later in 1871, that the differences between the minds of humans and higher animals were of degree, not of kind. Wallace, however, after decades of reflection, grew increasingly convinced that the human mind, particularly the faculties of abstract reasoning, artistic sensibility, and moral intuition, could not be fully explained by natural selection alone. He saw these traits as too advanced, too disconnected from mere survival. In fact, Wallace posited that a higher intelligence or guiding principle might have intervened in the development of the human mind and consciousness. This stance would later be described as Wallace's spiritualism or teleological leanings, setting him apart from Darwin's more strictly naturalistic view. A dinner conversation. One evening in the early 1860s, Wallace found himself back in England for a spell, and Darwin invited him to Down House for dinner. Present at the table were Emma Darwin, Joseph Hooker, and a few other confidants in the scientific circle. The discussion turned, as it often did, to the question of the human mind. After the plates had been cleared away, Wallace leaned forward. "Charles," he began, "you have most ably shown how selection can account for the subtleties of an orchid's nectar spur or a bird's plumage. But do you not think there is something in man's intellect that goes beyond the purely utilitarian function of survival?" Darwin raised his eyebrows. "How do you mean, Alfred?" "Well," Wallace continued, trying to phrase his thoughts carefully, "take mathematics, for instance. We delve into abstractions that have no direct bearing on day-to-day survival. And yet, the universal truth of these abstractions can be grasped by the human mind. Surely natural selection alone wouldn't account for such a capacity, which seems to transcend the needs of the struggle for existence." Darwin took a moment, eyes briefly flicking to Emma for her reaction, though she merely listened with the same gentle interest she always displayed. "I confess," Darwin said slowly, "that I see it differently. Our capacities for abstraction and morality likely arose from incremental steps, small variations that conferred social and intellectual advantages. Over long epochs, these became pronounced." Wallace smiled politely, though a crease formed on his brow. "Even so, my instincts suggest a guiding force. I cannot envision how so lofty a faculty could derive solely from slight variations, beneficial though they might be." A silence descended, broken only by Hooker's attempt to shift the topic to botany. Yet the tension remained. Darwin and Wallace, though still cordial, had discovered a fundamental divergence in how they viewed humanity's place in nature. Letters of disagreement. In the months that followed, Darwin and Wallace exchanged letters on the subject. While they never allowed their difference of opinion to curdle into personal rancor, the strain was evident. Darwin, the ever-cautious gentleman, tried to couch his disagreements in measured language. "My dear Wallace," he wrote, "it pains me that we cannot see eye to eye on the question of the mind's evolution. Yet I remain persuaded that consciousness and intellect, while extraordinary, are governed by the same laws of variation and selection that shape all life." Wallace, from his vantage, responded, "I fully respect your position, Mr. Darwin, yet I see evidence in the leaps of artistic and mathematical genius for an intelligence beyond what selection can explain, like a hidden dimension guiding the development of the human race. Should we not at least be open to the possibility?" Their tone remained amicable, but beneath the surface lay the recognition that their once parallel paths in evolutionary theory now diverged significantly on the point of human consciousness. Public reception and private doubts. As Darwin's On the Origin of Species gained traction, with subsequent editions making corrections and clarifications, the public debate raged. The clergy, certain politicians, and conservative scholars railed against Darwinism, seeing it as a direct challenge to the biblical account of creation. Meanwhile, progressive thinkers seized upon the concept of evolution as a broader metaphor for social advancement. Wallace found himself applauded in some circles for his emphasis on a teleological aspect. Those who couldn't stomach the notion of purely naturalistic human origins sometimes invoked Wallace's perspective as a more palatable alternative. Others derided him for, in their view, muddying the clarity of the theory by introducing a spiritual dimension. Darwin, for his part, was not altogether comfortable with the fervour surrounding his work. Privately, he questioned whether he had done enough to anticipate the religious backlash or to clarify the moral and societal ramifications. Still, he remained unflinching in his conviction that natural selection applied uniformly across all species, humans included. A mutually respectful distance. By the late 1860s, Darwin and Wallace's friendship had settled into an understanding. They were allies in articulating the mechanism of natural selection, co-discoverers credited jointly in the annals of science. Their difference regarding the human mind became something of a polite taboo in their discourse. Each recognized that the other had come by his beliefs earnestly. When Darwin published The Descent of Man in 1871, Wallace reviewed it with genuine respect for Darwin's scholarship, yet reiterated his own perspective that the human intellect might owe some of its loftiest attributes to an unseen spiritual agency. Darwin, though never directly confrontational, sometimes confided his exasperation to close friends. "I cannot see how Wallace, so brilliant in his observations, can hold to such a notion, but he is a man of sincerity, and I suspect he will not be easily swayed." And indeed, Wallace was not swayed. Over time, Wallace became involved in social movements. He was passionate about social justice and land reform, and he ventured further into areas that Darwin found perplexing, such as spiritualism. Yet their cordiality remained intact, built on the bedrock of mutual accomplishment, and the memory of that 1858 moment when they had together unveiled the greatest unifying principle in biology. Reflections on a legacy. In the twilight of their careers, both men looked back with a measure of satisfaction. Darwin, plagued by chronic illness and wearied by years of controversy, found solace in his gardens at Down House, continuing to study earthworms, climbing plants, and other humble facets of nature. Wallace, older and more secure in his reputation, wrote extensively on his travels, social reforms, and the broader implications of evolutionary theory. For Darwin, the question of the human mind was not left wholly unanswered, but he chose to address it in naturalistic terms in The Descent of Man. Wallace, for his part, published contributions to the theory of natural selection and later works, wherein he voiced his conviction that evolution required something extra, a guiding intelligence, for the emergence of human consciousness. Whenever they corresponded in those later years, their letters struck a tone of warm recollection. "I recall how kind you were in presenting my essay," Wallace would write. Darwin, equally warm, would reply, "My friend, without your letter from Ternate, I might still be refining my manuscript. You drove me to share our theory with the world." Thus, even as they parted philosophical ways over the evolution of the mind, their bond as co-discoverers of natural selection endured. Epilogue. Two paths, converged and diverged. On April 19, 1882, Charles Darwin passed away at Down House. He was later interred in Westminster Abbey, near Isaac Newton, a testament to the significance that Britain placed on his scientific legacy. Alfred Russel Wallace, deeply moved, penned a heartfelt tribute acknowledging Darwin's generosity and the monumental impact of On the Origin of Species. In that tribute, Wallace reiterated how Darwin had tirelessly built the edifice of evidence, while Wallace had contributed one brick in its construction. Wallace himself lived until 1913, always credited as the co-discoverer of natural selection. He died a respected figure, albeit one who never quite matched Darwin's cultural ascendancy. His convictions about the human mind, though overshadowed by mainstream Darwinism, paved the way for discussions at the intersection of science, philosophy, and religion. In the grand narrative of evolutionary theory, Darwin and Wallace stand as twin pillars. Their moment of intellectual convergence, made manifest in that July 1, 1858, meeting of the Linnaean Society, was among the most pivotal in scientific history. They shared the triumph of revealing a principle that would forever alter our understanding of life's tapestry, even if, when it came to the most peculiar tapestry of all, the human mind, they parted ways. Final reflection. One can imagine Darwin, in his study on that fateful summer day, scrutinizing Wallace's ternate essay and muttering, "He has it, by God." That moment redefined his sense of urgency, propelling him to publish. Wallace, half a world away, had unknowingly lit a spark under the elder naturalist. Their paths of discovery converged in a most dramatic fashion, culminating in a joint presentation before the Linnaean Society, a moment that quietly set off an intellectual revolution. Yet the same spark that united them on evolution by natural selection would reveal a profound fork in the road concerning humanity's higher faculties. Darwin walked the path of a thoroughgoing naturalist, insisting that all aspects of human cognition, emotion, and morality arose from evolutionary continuity with the animal kingdom. Wallace took the road that allowed for a spiritual or teleological dimension, seeing the human mind as a leap beyond mere survival advantage. In retrospect, their divergence underscores the richness of scientific inquiry. Great ideas often sprout variations just as species do. In the end, Darwin and Wallace's friendship and collaborative spirit remind us that science is not solely shaped by competition, but also by moments of mutual discovery, integrity, and respect, even when ultimate conclusions differ. After all, for both men, the pursuit of truth was the grandest adventure of all.
Questions for our mind. Four forces were combined, creating the illusion of time. Gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force. Worlds almost swirling to dark energy and dark matter that we cannot see or comprehend. Physics is reality's background. We live in a multiverse of possibilities. E equals mc squared is the defining parameters of what we can know. Nothing is our infinity beyond.